Welcome aboard, Chosen One. And don't act shocked that you're here. You earned this seat. You fought your way through things others wouldn't have survived for 5 minutes. And now you're being welcomed like the main character finally stepping onto their real stage. The air feels different around you. Even your silence carries weight. And the people who used to laugh at you are strangely quiet these days. Funny how the same mouths that mocked you suddenly don't know where to aim their words anymore. Funny how their whole presence collapses the moment you walk into the room. They feel it before you even speak, and it drives them insane because they spent so long pretending you were nothing. Look at them now. Remember the ones who said you were trying too hard, the ones who swore you were delusional, the ones who told you to stay in your lane. Look who's now scrambling to understand you. Look who's whispering your name in rooms you were once banned from. Look who's secretly checking your profile assuming you won't notice. Every single one of them thought you'd fold. Instead, you became exactly the version of yourself their worst nightmares warned them about. Someone in a suit just leaned across their pristine desk, adjusted their expensive glasses, and asked a question they thought would put you in your place. Who trained you? They asked it as if expecting a name, a program, a list of credentials they could run through their little system. They wanted a file, a label, something to shrink you down into a category. They wanted proof that you came from somewhere they could trace, approve, control, or dismiss. But you didn't play their game. You didn't give them the comfort of a story that made sense to them. You just sat back, calm, breathing like someone who has already survived worse than anything they could threaten you with. And when you said, "Nobody trained me," the room changed. The pens stopped, shoulders tensed, and for a second, the mask slipped. That wasn't confusion anymore. That was fear trying to stay professional. That was a hierarchy cracking because you weren't shaped in a classroom. You weren't molded by some elite mentor. You were forged in the shadows, in the long nights, in the phases nobody understood, in the breakdowns, in the silent rebuilds nobody saw. You were shaped by life itself, not by a curriculum. That's why they can't predict your next move. That's why they can't measure you with their outdated little charts. You're the glitch in their system, the question mark their algorithm can't solve, and they hate that. They hate that you climbed without permission. They hate that instead of collapsing under the things meant to erase you, you hit back harder every time. You became this untrained, unstoppable anomaly that nobody can take credit for. No blueprint, no manual, no instructions to reverse engineer. You know what really eats them alive? They remember the old you, the you who used to doubt everything, the you who questioned your worth because of what they said, the you who walked into rooms shrinking yourself so no one would call you too much. And now they watch you standing over the ruins of every lie built around your name. They don't understand how you went from trying to terrifying. They don't understand how you turned your wounds into weapons. They don't understand how you built yourself from scratch while they were betting on your collapse. Let's talk about that shift. That moment when everything inside you went quiet, as if the world paused just so you could breathe. That moment right after the storm, when the universe stopped playing with you and started pushing you forward. There's a certain stillness that comes when you're done breaking, when you've accepted every scar, when you no longer fear being misunderstood, when you realize you don't need validation because your life has already proven your point. Your enemies felt that shift before you did. Ever notice how they backed off before you even rose up? How they went from loud to quiet? How they suddenly seemed confused around you, as if standing in the aftermath of their own bad decisions. They saw you becoming something they had no vocabulary to describe, and it terrified them. You walked out of your past like a survivor stepping out of a burning building, not even coughing, no fanfare, no speech, just that calm energy of, "I'm not the same anymore," and the world adjusted itself around you. People started treating you differently without knowing why. Doors that were once welded shut opened. Opportunities found you that you never even applied for. That's what happens when the universe decides someone is done being underestimated. Let's go even deeper. Ever wonder why people from your past act strange around you now? It's because they remember who you were, but they're standing in front of who you became. They're trying to map an old version of you onto your new reality, and the math keeps failing. They don't understand how you found strength where most people find excuses. They don't understand how you kept going when most would have stayed on the ground crying. They don't understand how you turned humiliation into fuel, but you understand. You lived it. You're the kind of person trained by betrayal, sharpened by abandonment, conditioned by loss, and perfected by failure. Pain was your coach. Silence was your classroom. Survival was your diploma. And now the world looks at the result and assumes it came from some elite academy. Meanwhile, you're standing there, hands in your pockets, thinking, "I taught myself everything you're afraid of." That's why the suit panicked. That's why the room shifted. That's why their confidence cracked. You're not a product of their system. You're the warning label they forgot to print. Chosen One, this is your moment. Not because someone crowned you, but because nobody did. And that's exactly why you're dangerous. 1. They fear what built you. Funny how the loudest critics start stuttering once they realize you survived things that would have folded them like cheap lawn chairs. They don't know what to do with you. And that's the sweetest part of this whole story. Every enemy who once smirked at your struggle is now choking on the fact that you were built in a place they would never have lasted. They trained in safe environments with padded walls and backup plans. You trained in silence. They had people clapping for their small progress. You had nobody. They had mentors holding their hands. You had empty rooms and consequences waiting to strike if you slipped. Now they're confused. Now they're intimidated. Now they whisper, "Who trained them?" as if you're some anomaly that shouldn't exist. Good. Let it sink in. Because here's the truth that hits them like a punch. You didn't come from their world. You weren't handcrafted by their neat systems. You weren't certified, authorized, approved, or stamped. You were forged, not instructed. Shaped in chaos they run from. Strengthened by storms they never had the courage to walk through. Every failure, every betrayal, every night you had to rebuild your mind from scratch became the training they wish they could buy. And that scares them. You didn't climb the ladder. You burned it and walked up through the smoke. They look at you and feel insulted by your very existence. How dare you be this good without their guidance? How dare you know things you never learned in their classrooms? How dare you stand there calm and sharp, like someone who survived a battlefield they've only seen on motivational posters? That's the bruise you leave on their ego. Here's the part they'll never admit but always feel. You shattered their illusion. They believed power only came from institutions, connections, and credentials. Then you walked in with nothing but scars, instinct, and self-taught precision. Suddenly they realize their entire hierarchy is a joke. You're proof their system isn't the source of greatness. You're the proof they hoped would never appear. And yes, chosen one, some part of you still wonders, why do they react to me like that? Why does my presence make them uncomfortable? Because you remind them of their limitations. While they were chasing approval, you were becoming unstoppable. While they were networking, you were surviving. While they studied theory, you wrestled with life barehanded. They memorized instructions, you memorized pain. They learned from textbooks, you learned from consequences. They practiced in simulated environments. You practiced in reality, where failure actually hurts. Tell me which one produces the more dangerous person. You're the kind of person who leveled up through adversity. Every time life swung at you, it accidentally trained you. Abandonment taught you independence. Loneliness sharpened your intuition. Rejection made you resourceful. Failure strengthened your adaptability. And heartbreak made your emotional armor so tough they can't pierce it, no matter how hard they try. They hate that your entire skill set wasn't handed to you. It was carved into you. They hate that you didn't crumble like they predicted. They hate that you built yourself without asking for their permission or approval. They hate that every setback only made you smarter, colder, sharper. They hate that you can walk into a room and read every insecurity trying to size you up. They hate that you don't need validation because you survived long enough to validate yourself. And they especially hate that your strength didn't come from a mentor they could shake hands with. It came from pain they can't even imagine. Let's be clear, being self-forged doesn't mean you were reckless. It means you learned the hard way, the way most people avoid. You learned to breathe through chaos. You learned to solve problems alone. You learned to sit with your own thoughts without running. You learned to rise without applause. You learned to trust your instincts more than other people's opinions. You learned to grow in the dark where nobody clapped for you. Do you know what that makes you? Dangerous in ways they were never trained to handle. 2. The lessons they wished you never learned. Wild ones learn truths that classroom kids spend their whole lives running from. Some of us didn't study chapters, we survived them. Your mistakes were your professors, and they taught harder than any institution ever could. They don't fear you because you're trained. They fear you because you learned what they were too soft to face. Let's turn the spotlight on the years nobody saw. The quiet years, the forgotten years, the years when you weren't getting applause, recognition, or guidance. The years when you were supposed to collapse and somehow you didn't. Everyone else sat in climate-controlled lecture halls, highlighting textbooks, rehearsing answers a system spoon-fed them. You, meanwhile, were somewhere the system never visits, knee-deep in your own chaos, gathering wisdom from wounds, decoding life with nothing but instinct, shaping yourself with tools you carved by hand. That's the curriculum they don't teach. They don't even acknowledge it exists, because admitting it means admitting you learned more in your worst year than they learned in their entire degree. Imagine a group of students in a polished classroom, learning crisis management from a multiple-choice worksheet, while you were out there living crises in real time, improvising strategies that actually worked, adapting on the fly because your life depended on it. Their training wheels were still on while you rode through storms with no brakes. Your education wasn't structured, it wasn't safe, it wasn't supervised. It was raw, unfiltered, and brutally honest. Pain didn't wait for you to take notes. Failure didn't let you retake the test. You learned in real time, bruises still fresh, hands still shaking, breath still unsteady. That's why your knowledge is carved into you, not memorized but internalized. They learned emotional intelligence from a TED Talk, while you learned it from someone you trusted stabbing you in the back. They learned theories about human behavior. You learned people. They learned from lectures. You learned from losses so brutal they rewired you. Which one do you think produces sharper instincts? People like you didn't just survive the curriculum. You became the curriculum. While they collected certificates like trading cards, you collected scars that taught you more than any diploma ever could. They were graded on participation. You were graded on resilience. Their tests were scheduled. Yours showed up unannounced at 3 a.m. Their assignments were simulations. Yours were real situations. And every time you completed one, you leveled up in ways they still can't understand. They practiced negotiation in group exercises where everyone just pretended to care. You negotiated with reality itself: bills, heartbreak, loss, mental weight, survival. You didn't practice social cues in a safe workshop. You read people when something real was actually at stake. That's why one glance at someone and you already know their patterns, their nervous tells, their angle of attack, while they're still flipping through a communication skills handbook. This is what terrifies them. You didn't learn in simulation, you learned in impact. Every setback became a case study you dissected alone. Every betrayal became research material you analyzed until you understood the anatomy of manipulation. Every disappointment taught you how to rebuild expectations without losing your soul. Every failure taught you architecture, how to build better structures from ruins. People trained inside systems don't understand that kind of growth. They're used to step-by-step instructions, mentors, feedback, structured improvement. You had none of that. You had silence, struggle, and a universe demanding you evolve or crumble. You learned to see patterns in chaos because chaos was your textbook. You learned to find structure in destruction because destruction was your environment. You learned to stay calm in storms because storms lived in your chest for years. That's why your mind works differently. Ever wonder why you see through people so fast? Why you can feel danger before it arrives? Why you sense opportunities others are blind to? Because you learned in real life, not in a program. Your instincts were sharpened by necessity, not lectures. And maybe you've asked yourself, why do I feel older than my age? Why does it feel like I've already lived several lives? Because you have. When you learn from collapse, you age in wisdom. When you learn from loss, you grow in clarity. When you learn from isolation, you gain a patience nobody taught you. People who faced half of what you went through would still be in therapy trying to make sense of it. You made sense of it alone. They learned theory. You absorbed truth. They followed steps. You followed survival. They built confidence on praise. You built confidence on proof. That's why yours doesn't crack under pressure, while theirs falls apart at the first sign of discomfort. When the suit leaned forward and asked who trained you, the real answer wasn't nobody. The real answer was, life trained you harder than any mentor. Pain trained you sharper than any professor. Silence taught you deeper than any program. Loss made you wiser than any textbook. And the universe watched you learn every step of the way. That's why you intimidate them. That's why they whisper. That's why their voices shake. You didn't graduate from their system. You escaped it and came back smarter than its creators. 3 through 12. What grew in the quiet years? They thought you vanished. In truth, you were leveling up in the shadows, gathering a strength they couldn't measure. During those invisible years, when your name dropped out of circulation, they mistook your silence for failure while showing off their promotions, certificates, and stage success. They updated their profile. You updated your entire soul. Being invisible doesn't mean being unproductive. It means being undetectable. You weren't losing. You were evolving. Some people study survival. You lived it. That's why your knowledge hits harder than their entire education system. Their students got worksheets. You got wounds. Their lessons were graded in red pen. Yours were graded by reality itself, and reality hands out no pity points. When survival is your professor, you don't forget the material. You embody it. Systems don't fear rebels. They fear what they can't calculate. When the suit asks who trained you, they're not looking for a label, they're really asking, how do we control you? And when you answer, nobody trained me, the whole room tilts. Your unpredictability isn't a flaw, it's your superpower. Your lack of credentials isn't a gap, it's a shield. They want your past to make sense because if it doesn't, neither does their entire system. You're living proof that institutional approval isn't the only path to mastery, that brilliance can grow in the cracks, not just in classrooms. Your skill set scares them because it wasn't learned, it was survived. Everything that was just a Tuesday for you sounds like trauma to them. They stop asking questions halfway through your story because your life becomes a mirror reflecting everything they never had to face. You didn't just challenge their rules, you exposed how flimsy those rules always were. If someone with no formal training, no elite mentorship, can outperform their polished, highly credentialed professionals, then their system was never enough. They don't fear your attitude. They fear the fact that you exist outside their leash. Your existence proves they don't control the world as tightly as they pretend. You're the exception they can't regulate. They can't weaponize what they didn't build, and they can't break what they never held. You're untouchable, and it eats at them from the inside. Their entire system runs on leverage and control, but you walked in with none of their strings attached, no credentials to revoke, no network to poison. You didn't take a course on resilience. You survived the kind of chapters that would send most people crawling. While they sat in climate-controlled classrooms, you learned emotional regulation by staying calm while your entire life shook like an unstable tower. They can copy your moves, but they'll never copy the war that taught you to make them. Your path doesn't scale. It only works for people who were cornered, ignored, underestimated, and forced to evolve under pressure that would send ordinary minds spiraling. You're the anomaly that shattered their pattern. You're not rare, you're unreproducible. And now it all comes together. They finally understand that you're not a product of their world. You're the exception that exposes their limitations. You rose without their guidance, mastered what they tried to gatekeep, and became the phenomenon they'll never figure out. That's your victory, chosen one.